Hi, everyone. So we're going to start going through the ICD-10 official guidelines for coding and reporting. And, I was trying to get everything in my book to line up. And honestly, the fonts are so tiny that I couldn't possibly share with you the way that I wanted to. So I printed out the guidelines so that we could see them clearly and we could have a chat about them. And remember that if you're taking the AAPC's CPC exam, you are allowed to print out the official guidelines and bring them with you as a printout. Now, there's pros and cons to that. It's another resource that you're going to have to be accountable for. And it's in your book, and that might be easier for you to manage because it's already there. But either way, it's your choice. I do want to remind you that AAPC has a very strict rule that if you print it out on one-sided, that the blank side may not have any notes on it. Okay, so this blank side must remain blank. So we're only going to make notes on the document that has words on it, right, on this guidance here. A couple of things I like to start off with, and that is recognize that in the instructions, they tell us that these guidelines have been approved by 4 organizations that make up the cooperating parties for ICD-10-CM. Remember, we have a clinical modification here in the United States, which is a little bit different than the ICD-10 that other countries report around the world. So our 4 organizations that make up the cooperating parties are the American Hospital Association, the AHA, the American Health Information Management, the AHIMA, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the NCHS. The NCHS is the National Center for Health Statistics. So they're the ones who review and approve these reporting guidelines there. You also want to make sure that you're looking at the current fiscal year guidelines. So fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. Our current ICD-10 guidelines and ICD-10 codes run during that fiscal year. So we will have an update to these codes October 1st, 2023. So I want to go ahead and bypass the table of contents and go straight to section 1. There are 4 sections to the ICD-10 guidelines, but section 1 is the one that has the 3 subsections: the conventions, the general coding guidelines, and the chapter specific guidelines. So we're going to start with looking at the conventions. And the conventions just basically mean that we're talking about how to use the book. How do we use our ICD-10 book? How do we select an ICD-10 code? So when you're reading these paragraphs, what you want to do is paraphrase what is the information that they're telling me. Because again, if we're taking a test or if we're auditing or if we're in our general production coding, going back and rereading these paragraphs can be very time consuming. So I like to go through the guidelines and make little specific notes that apply to what are they trying to say? What's the point, right? So I've started the very beginning here. The alphabetic index and tabular list. And the only thing that they're telling us here is that we have 2 areas that our codes are reported. The first area is the alphabetic index, or the alpha index. And this is where we look up the disease, injury, or illness, or the reason for the admission or the encounter. So you have those 1, 2, 3, 4 areas that you would be looking for your diagnosis codes. The next, you're going to go to the tabular section. So you have your alpha index, which is comprised of your disease, injury, illness, or the reason for the visit. The second is the tabular list. And here's where you're going to find further instructions that apply to selecting the most specific codes. They couldn't possibly do all of that in the alpha index. And so we always start in the alpha index looking for the default or the direction that we want to go in, almost like your table of content in any book or textbook that you have, right? And your final selection comes from the tabular list. Then we go into the format and the structure of each one of those codes. Now, the codes themselves, they function very much like a nomenclature. Each one of those code categories or subcategories, they actually have a meaning to them. So they're telling you that codes can be anywhere from a 3-character to a 7-character code selection. But remember that each one of those areas has its own meaning to it. So when we look at the first meaning, let's use a code from the S chapter, right? This means what chapter it is, right? The second location and the third location, the second and third, these are going to give you the specificity, right? And so let's look up S86. S86 is injury of the muscle, the fascia, the tendon at the lower leg. But we know that there's more information that we can add to that. There would be another code, another digit or another character here that would be added for maybe the site. And if we add 0, 0 is going to give us the Achilles tendon. If we add another character, this is going to give us the severity, right? So we'll add 1 here, and that severity is going to be a strain. And then if we wanted to add maybe laterality, we could add another code here to indicate that this is a strain of the right Achilles tendon. And lastly, we have our 7th character. Our 7th character is going to give us the encounter. So is this the initial encounter, the subsequent encounter, or is it the sequela encounter? So we add the section A. And now if we go into the tabular section and we look for S86.011A, it's going to tell you that this is a strain of the right Achilles tendon initial encounter. So each one of these sections here has its own definition, and that's why we need to preserve these characters. Now, not all codes are going to have laterality. Not all codes are going to have a severity. Not all codes are going to have a site, but they may require the encounter, and the encounter can only live in the 7th spot. So if we go down further here, and now we've kind of covered everything from section 2 and section 3. If we go down to section 4 here, it tells us that when a code requires that 7th character, right? And we don't have laterality, severity, or site. So say that the code ends and it does not include that site, severity, or laterality, because maybe it's not appropriate. Not all codes have those reporting characteristics. But if it requires a 7th character, that 7th character of A or D or S, that is the only location that it can be in. And so they're advising us to use the X character as a placeholder for that site, severity, and laterality that doesn't exist with that code, but still requires that 7th character. Does that make sense, friends? Let's go on to the next. This is advising us that the 7th character can only live in the 7th character. It can't live in any other character. So they're just reiterating that same information to you over and over again. Next, we're going to come to abbreviations. And the first abbreviation is not elsewhere classified. So for example, if the provider wrote that the patient had a tickly cough. Now, when I go to the alpha index and I look under cough, which is the disease, injury, or illness, there isn't a specificity for tickly cough, right? So when we see that I know the type of cough it is, but there isn't a code, then it's not elsewhere classified. Or there's an other specification, but I don't have a code for it. So not elsewhere classified also equals other. So I know what kind of code it is. It is documented as a tickly cough, but I don't have a code for tickly cough. So I'm going to use a not elsewhere classified code or an other code because I know what kind it is. I just don't have that specific code. Different than not otherwise specified. This is where the provider just reports a cough. It doesn't tell you, so the type is not specified. So I don't know what kind of cough this is. It is unspecified. So we use the not otherwise specified when we don't know what kind of specificity belongs to that disease, injury, or illness. Same thing applies here in the tabular list. You've got your not elsewhere classified, meaning your other specified, that tickly cough, or not otherwise specified, unspecified, right? So the same thing applies there when we have those codes. Now we get into specific punctuation that you see within the ICD-10-CM book. And the first punctuation talks about these parentheses here. These brackets. The brackets are used in the tabular list to enclose synonyms, alternative wording, or explanatory phases. Brackets are used in the alpha index to identify manifestations. And when we see manifestations, it might mean that we need to add an additional code to describe those manifestations. Parentheses, they're used in both the tabular and the alpha index there, and they're for supplementary words. So for example, we could see something listed as acute or chronic, or this is going to let us know that these are words that are usually associated with that term that's being reported. So again, they're called non-essential modifiers because it could be an acute enteritis or a chronic enteritis, right? All enteritises are reported with this default. So again, just using the enteritis to match the example that was given to us. Colons are used in the tabular list after an incomplete term, which needs one or more modifiers. And remember, we're not talking about coding modifiers, right? We're talking about additional information following the colon to make it assignable to a given category. The use of and, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Other and unspecified codes. We're going to go back to that whole NEC, not elsewhere classified, right? They remind us that the code does not exist. We have a tickly cough, right? But there's no code for tickly cough. So we're going to use that other code for that tickly cough. Unspecified is when we have a cough and it's not specified as to what kind of cough. It's unspecified. There's no additional information. So the additional information is not provided to select a more specific code. So these are going to be your NOS, not otherwise specified. Your include terms. This note appears immediately after a 3-character code title to further define or give an example of a content in the category. So for those of you that know, also known as, or AKA, right? Those are the included terms, also known as terms. Same with your inclusion terms. These are a list of terms for condition where the code is to be used. So again, you could have your inclusion terms, meaning that it could be the tickly cough, it could be the productive cough, it could be the whatever that is. All of those will be coded with the same code. So use same code. Now we're going to get into the big ugly. This is the big ugly, the exclusion notes there. I don't know why they called them excludes 1 and excludes 2. I'm going to be honest with you. I would have never picked that if I'd been asked, but I wasn't asked. So the excludes 1, it means do not code here. Do not code here. So let's look at an example. The word acquired. Versus congenital. Congenital means that you were born with it. Acquired means that you developed it. You can't acquire it and be born with it. You either acquired it or you were born with it. And so that's a great explanation of where you would see an excludes 1 requirement. You cannot code both an acquired and a congenital condition. There is a hard excludes 1 that says, no, you cannot code those two together. They do not exist in nature together. You were either born with it or you developed it. So that's a good example. This is an example of acquired versus congenital is an excludes 1, either or. Another great example of excludes 1, type 1 diabetes versus type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, the pancreas does not work. It doesn't work at all. There's nothing we can do for it. The patient has to take insulin because the pancreas doesn't work. It's just holding space. Type 2 diabetes, the pancreas works a little. It needs some help. It's struggling. It's not functioning at its full capacity, but it is functioning. So you cannot have type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. It's either or. That's a great example of excludes. These cannot be reported together. Absolutely not. Do not code those two together. There is an exception to the excludes 1, and that exception is going to be the provider statement. If the provider reports that these two conditions exist together, then we code them together. But remember that you may get a denial because there is an excludes 1 note. Okay. Excludes 2. It means that we do not have a combo code, a combination code to report both conditions. So let's say that you've had chronic sinusitis. And you've had this for the last 2 years. And then your nephew comes over for Christmas break and wonderfully gives you an acute case of sinusitis. Well, we don't have a code for acute sinusitis, acute on a chronic sinusitis. And so you would have to report both codes, the acute sinusitis and then the chronic sinusitis, because there's an exclusion 2 note that says that acute sinusitis does not include chronic sinusitis. And when the two are present, you must code them together. Now, this is one of those areas I think is something that we see a lot when we have denied codes, because there is an instruction of how we should sequence these codes. So certain codes have both an underlying etiology and multiple body system manifestations due to an underlying etiology. For such conditions, ICD-10 has a coding convention that requires the underlying condition to be sequenced first. So the first code should be the underlying condition, if applicable, followed by the manifestation. So the second code should be the manifestation. Whenever a combination exists, there is a use additional code at the etiology code and a code first at the manifestation code. Get it? Manifestation code comes second. You should have an underlying condition coded first. These instructional notes indicate the proper sequencing order of the codes, the etiology, followed by the manifestation. Okay, so they're giving us instructions of what comes first. In most cases, the manifestation code will have a code title in diseases classified elsewhere. Codes with this title are a component of the etiology and manifestation convention. The code title indicates that it is a manifestation code. When you see in diseases classified elsewhere. In diseases classified elsewhere, codes are never permitted to be used as a first, never permitted to be used as a first or principal diagnosis code. They must be used in conjunction with an underlying condition code. They're telling us here how that should be properly sequenced. Again, see a category F02 dementia in other classified diseases classified elsewhere, for example, of this convention. There are manifestation codes that do not have in diseases classified elsewhere in their title. And for such codes, there is a use an additional code note at the etiology and a code first note at the manifestation code. So again, manifestations should not be the primary diagnosis code. In addition to the notes in the tabular list, these conditions also have a specific alphabetic index entry structure. In the alphabetic index, both conditions are listed together, with the etiology code first, followed by the manifestation code in the brackets. The codes in the brackets are always sequenced secondary. Wonderful information there. Now I'm underlining. You could use a highlighter if you want to highlight these specific things. Just remember not to highlight absolutely everything, okay? Because the truth of the matter is, if you highlight everything, then you're going to be encouraged to read everything when you only need to be reminded of these certain areas in diseases classified elsewhere, or the code in brackets is always sequenced second. So maybe you just want to highlight these are always sequenced second, right? An example of etiology manifestation convention is dementia with Parkinson's disease. In the alphabetic index, the code is G20, is listed first, followed by the F02.80 or F02.801 in brackets. Code G20 represents the underlying etiology, Parkinson's disease. You must be sequenced first. Whereas F02.80 and F02.81 represent the manifestation of the dementia in the disease classified elsewhere with or without behavioral disturbances. Code first or use additional code notes are always used as sequencing rules in the classification of certain codes. So just to show you this one more time, okay, the first code would be a code first in sequencing. A second code would be a use additional code, would be your second code. So in sequencing, code first, that is your first code. Additional code, that is your second code or any code following, right? So they're giving you sequencing information right in your guidelines. Now, the next area talks about the word and. The word and should be interpreted to mean and or when it appears. Here's a great example. Tuberculosis of the bones, tuberculosis of joints, tuberculosis of bones and joints. These are classified to the subcategory of tuberculosis of the bones and joints. So when you see that word and, that means you can use a combo code like tuberculosis of the bones and joints. So we see bones, we see joints, but we have that combo code. We should use that combo code when we see those together. The word with or in should be interpreted to mean associated with or due to when it appears in a code title. So when the code has the word with in it, we assume that those two are related to each other. So there is a relationship. This appears in the code title in the alpha index or an instructional note in the tabular list. The classification presumes a causal relationship between the two conditions and is linked by the terms in the alphabet or the tabular list. These conditions should be coded as related, even in the absence of the provider's documentation, explicitly linking them together, unless, of course, you have contradicting documentation. So it says that it is not associated with. So then we would not assume that relationship. But otherwise, unless we're told differently, we assume that there is a causal relationship when we see those two conditions listed together. For conditions not specifically linked by these rationale terms in the classification, or when guidelines require that a linkage between two conditions be explicitly documented, provider documentation must link those conditions in order to code them as related. The word with in the alpha index is sequenced immediately following the main term, not the alphabetical order. Okay, so we see that a lot in the alphabetic index where they're talking about anemia with or a condition with, right? And so we can assume that there is a causal relationship between those two. Now, C and C also, well, this is pretty easy to understand. The C instructions following the main term in the alpha index indicates that another term should be referenced. So if you can't find it in the alpha list or alpha index, then look at the C or C also. So if you can't find it under anemia and it tells you to see blood disorders, go to blood disorders. And that's what they're telling you. The term C also instructs the following: a main term in the alpha index instructs that there is another main term that might also be referenced. If you can't find it in the alpha index, then look at the C or the C also. That is another place that you might be able to find the code that you're looking for. A code also note instructs that two codes may be required to describe the condition, but this note does not provide sequencing directions. The sequencing depends on the circumstances of the encounter. So this is also very much like a use additional if it's relevant, right? You could also code if you know the drug that caused the overdose. Does that make sense? Default codes. Default codes, we find them in the alpha index. This one gives me a little bit of trouble. I'll be honest with you. This one keeps me up at night sometimes because as a coder, I have been drilled to stay in my lane. Only code what the documentation states. However, the guidelines tell me that a code listed next to a main term in the ICD-10 alpha index is referred to as the default code. And the default code represents that condition that is most commonly associated with the main term, or is the unspecified code for the condition. If a condition is documented in the medical record, say, for example, appendicitis, without any information such as acute or chronic, the default code should be assigned. So it will tell me to assign a specific code. And we do this through the alpha index. And then we go to the tabular for a more specific code. Code assignment and clinical criteria. The assignment of a diagnosis code is based on the provider's diagnostic statement. What other proof do I need? None. The provider's diagnostic statement that the condition exists. The provider's statement that the patient has a particular condition is sufficient. Code assignment is not based on clinical criteria used by the provider to establish the diagnosis. If there is a conflicting medical record documentation, query the provider. So the provider's word is what is necessary. So for example, if the provider says that the patient is COVID positive, we don't need to, as coders, go look for a positive COVID test. The fact that the provider documented that it was a positive COVID test is enough for us to diagnose, to assign the diagnosis code of COVID. Okay. Now, this one, I don't want you to get married to it. I don't want you to lose sleep over it, because those of you that are maybe risk coders, you know that in order to support the document, the diagnosis that's reported, we need a little bit more than just the provider's diagnostic statement. But this is for code assignment. The code assignment only needs the provider's document, the diagnostic statement there. That is sufficient. Just remember, for those of you that are risk coders, or those of you that have been doing this a long time, we do need to have a little bit of meat behind it to support that diagnosis, but to assign the code, the diagnostic statement. So I hope that that was helpful, that you're able to add some specific notes in your ICD-10 book about the section 1, subsection A, the conventions, how to use the book, how to understand this subsection. And I want you to like and subscribe our YouTube channel so that you will get notification of when the general coding guidelines get posted. And then we will be continuing with going through those chapter guidelines specifically. Also, make sure that you are setting a reminder every other Thursday to join us with Coding with Christine, where we are going to be breaking down each one of these sections of the ICD-10 guidelines with other subject matter experts in our industry here. Go to Stirling Global Solutions. Make sure that you have subscribed to our membership, where you're going to be able to have access to priceless information. Thanks for watching.